So first is Sean Donahue. He's an attorney with Donahue and Goldberg in Washington, D.C., and specializes in appellate litigation. Since establishing his practice in 2002, Sean has participated in several significant cases in the U.S. Supreme Court, including successfully briefing and arguing environmental defense versus Duke Energy Corp. For the petitioners, and serving as counsel of record for the environmental and public health organization parties in major Clean Act cases in the Supreme Court's 2013 and 2014 terms. He's argued more than 40 cases in various appellate courts, and his practice regularly includes representation of public interest organizations, governmental bodies, and private entities in appellate courts throughout the country. He's a graduate of the University of Chicago Law School. So first, Sean.
Thank you, Paul, and it's great to be here. I thought I'd say just a little bit about the litigation. I represent EDF and work with other environmental groups and the sort of whole cast of that are going to be supporting EPA in the litigation, and in the litigation Susan mentioned that has already occurred, and the challenges to the proposed Clean Power Plan. I thought I'd start with a little bit of background. That this agency action is a continuation of a set of actions that began with the Massachusetts versus EPA decision, where the Supreme Court confirmed that greenhouse gases are air pollutants under the Clean Air Act. And as you know, this administration took a series of actions, the Obama administration took a series of actions early on addressing greenhouse gas emissions from vehicles. Those actions and finding, first of all, that greenhouse gases endanger the public health and welfare. Those actions were intensely litigated and in the key respects upheld in the DC Circuit. And so now we're in moving to existing power plants. We are moving to the largest single source of greenhouse gas emissions. But there's a very logical flow to this. If you're going to apply the Clean Air Act to greenhouse gases, the sources that are the subject of this rule have to be covered if you're going to achieve anything meaningful. Another piece of background that's worth keeping in mind is the American Electric Power case, AEP versus Connecticut. This was a case that began out of frustration from a number of states, Connecticut, New York, and others, at inaction by the federal government on climate change. And they attempted to use the federal courts and a nuisance cause of action to proceed against large owners of large power plants and to get courts to impose emission reductions on them. In that case, ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and the court said, no, federal courts are not the right institution to be handling this problem. We have a Clean Air Act. We've said that greenhouse gases are a pollutant under the Clean Air Act, and we have provisions, including Section 111D, that speak directly to emissions of carbon dioxide from power plants. And that is the kind of remedy that you ought to be pursuing plaintiffs, not going into court. And so on the basis that there existed a Clean Air Act program addressing this very problem, the court denied a judicial remedy to Connecticut and New York and other states. And so what EPA is doing now is in that way as well, sort of following up on guidance from the Supreme Court. So maybe I'll describe the Clean Air Act contains an exclusive judicial review provision that says you have to sue to challenge national rules like this one only in one court, and that's the DC Circuit. Not all the statutes are like that. If you're following the Waters of the United States rule, there's a very untidy process of trying to figure out where we should even be litigating. But everybody knows the DC Circuit will be the place for this rule. And as Susan Hedman pointed out, there were a series of cases that some parties were so eager to start litigating that they tried to sue before the rule was published. So we know more than we would otherwise know about the kinds of themes that the challengers are likely to raise in a couple of weeks when the rule is finally published. Among those, first of all, there are claims that EPA, notwithstanding the Massachusetts case and the AEP case shouldn't be acting at all, that the EPA is exceeding its authority and it doesn't have power to regulate in this area. And there are some technical statutory arguments. I don't think those are likely to succeed, but they've been pursued with great vigor, and I expect to see them again. And if successful, they would knock out the rule. And that's why, even though they seem to be long shots to me, they are attractive to litigants. And then I think, and that is the gist of that is, because EPA has regulated mercury and other hazardous air pollutants from power plants, under the Clean Air Act, it can't regulate carbon dioxide. And we think that's just, as a matter of common sense, an implausible conclusion, and we don't think anything in the Act requires it. But that's one argument that's going to be very prominent and was sort of the core of these early challenges. And then I think what's going to be probably the central issue is whether the way EPA determined the stringency of the emissions limits in this rule by looking at shifts in generation, either from relatively high emitting coal plants to natural gas plants that have a lower greenhouse gas emission rate, or from fossil generation to renewable generation, whether that is a permissible move. And this is the set of arguments that are sometimes summarized as the beyond the fence line arguments. And some of the challengers are likely to argue, you can't do this under the Act. The Clean Air Act requires that any emission limits have to be things that you can do right there at the unit, things you can put on the end of the pipe or other sort of physical modifications to the plant. And I think that's going to be kind of the core of the litigation. There will be lots of other claims, including a lot of sort of record-based claims about whether EPA got the numbers right and estimating renewables capacity and the many technical determinations it had to make. And I guess on the issue of how EPA determined the best system of emission reduction, I think I would say there's certainly a lot of rhetoric about it, but when it comes down to sort of applying the sort of pedestrian exercise of applying statutory language to a particular source category. And here I think the statutory language, like best system of emission reduction and adequately demonstrated, is very congenial to what EPA came up with, because EPA looked at this sector and said this is an interconnected power system where load is continuously balanced, so an increase in production from one unit is going to mean a decrease in production somewhere else. And EPA looked at what actors in this very complex industry actually do to reduce emissions, and that's sort of the core of how this plan works. And it's very much in line with what industry in other contexts and here too in many cases has urged the agency to do in thinking about how to control pollutants. Flexibility, amenability to emission trading, which is really central to how this rule will work, and keeping costs down. And I think those are all features that are very prominent in the rule. There will be very aggressive challenges, but there's some irony in that, given that this rule sort of bends over backwards to be flexible, to give states choice, to give every actor in the system a range of options. And so I think, I think that's something that is going to make it hard for some of the challenges to succeed. EPA did consider more sort of within the fence line approaches. There are things you can do. The heat rate improvement, EPA is part of the rule, but EPA found that it could achieve only a relatively small reduction in emissions. And indeed, if you did that alone, you could actually end up with perversely with an increase of emissions, so a kind of rebound effect. And then there are other things, though. You could retrofit power plants with carbon capture and sequestration. That's feasible, EPA found, at least in some cases. Or you could require conversion of coal plants to natural gas, or co-firing of coal plants with natural gas. The EPA considered those and found some sources might choose to comply with them, but they are more expensive than these other alternatives, and therefore they're not part of the best system of emission reduction. So interestingly, I think a lot of what has attracted a lot of fire about this rule, complexity, and the shifting component of it, and considering reductions in emissions off-site, are the very things that make it cost-effective and are the things that are sort of in line with what industry has long done and sort of wants. So an interesting feature of this kind of whole debate. There are some other issues that are likely to be prominent. There is an argument that Section 111D should only be about procedure, that EPA should be setting up a procedure for states to do plans, but then states have total discretion as to what the plans contain. We think that one's pretty much ruled out by the statutory language, which says that it's the administrator who decides what the best system of emission reduction is, and the administrator who gets to decide whether state plans are satisfactory. But that's an argument that looks like it's going to come up as well. So just as far as the process, once the rule is published, we expect petitions for review from the challengers, including Wisconsin and a number of other states. And some parties may seek to stay the rule, to block it. And normally that requires a showing of irreparable harm. So there will be discussions and debates about whether the petitioners are being hurt now, given that the rule has this relatively long rollout period where compliance isn't required until 2022, and states that want more time or need more time to submit their plans can get a 2-year extension. But we expect that will be sort of the first phase of the litigation, and will probably start within days or weeks of the filing of petitions for review. There are, based on filings so far, there's a substantial number of states that are going to challenge the rule. There are some industry, especially coal industry, associations and companies that are going to challenge it. And some national, like the Chamber of Commerce and other trade associations are likely to be in, and others who probably haven't declared themselves yet. And then supporting EPA, there will be a very substantial chorus of parties that will probably intervene or be amici, friends of the court. And those include a lot of states as well. A lot of states, including New York and California and a bunch of others, have participated as interveners in trying to ward off these early challenges, and I think they're likely to participate in the final rule challenges. Groups like My Client Environmental Defense Fund and a whole chorus of other NGOs will participate, and then we expect also there'll be pretty substantial business presence on EPA's side of the case as well, because there are an awful lot of businesses who believe this is really vital, that this plan is done in a way that's intelligent and careful, and that this is a problem we have to do something serious about. So there will be that angle too. It's not going to be a sort of business against regulator dichotomy. So we expect the litigation to unfold over the next year. If in some of these other big cases like the cross-state rule about interstate air pollution, the court sort of works on deciding whether to grant a stay before it then schedules merits briefing. It's not clear what the court will want to do here. This will probably be even bigger and more numerous in terms of parties than the litigations that we've seen under the Clean Air Act and the cross-state case and the first generation of greenhouse gas regulations. So it'll be a real case management challenge for everybody on all sides. There will be more lawyers wanting to have input on briefs than there will be words that the court is willing to read. And so people are going to have to exercise some self-restraint, which is hard for lawyers. But I expect that 2016, the merits briefing will unfold, and then we should get a decision sometime in late 2016, early 2017. I think with that, I will turn things over to Todd.